It's been said, I'm Brian Elliott, the Southwest Lake Ontario Watershed Coordinator with DEC's Great Lakes Program and in partnership with the Water Resources Institute. And I'm going to provide a little bit of background on lake trout, which is going to be the focal species of today's presentation. And we'll give a little bit of background on some other work that Dr. Atkinson has been doing that complements this work. So here's an illustrated example of a lake trout or Salvelinus namikush. And next slide, please. And so lake trout is a species of char or a type of salmonid that's native to the Great Lakes, including Lake Erie. They're closely related to and are in the same genus as brook trout, which is New York State's state fish. And they require cold, well-oxygenated water to thrive. So this typically means water is colder than 15 degrees Celsius, about 59 Fahrenheit, and above 4 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen. And lake trout habitat becomes limited during summer months when Lake Erie stratifies and surface waters warm up and bottom waters begin to lose oxygen. And lake trout spawning habitat, they prefer to spawn over rocky shoals or gravel bars with clean, silt-free and angular rocks exposed to high current. And you'll hear a lot more about lake trout spawning habitat from Dr. Atkinson and Dr. Atkinson and Dr. Jason Robinson shortly. And lake trout are top predators in their native ecosystem and feed on a variety of species, including rainbow smelt, mysids, a type of freshwater shrimp, alewife, and round goby. And they're a very popular sport fish in Lake Erie and other waters around the Great Lakes. And one interesting thing to note and highlight for Lake Erie specifically is that the New York State record for lake trout was caught in Lake Erie over 20 years ago, back in 2003, weighing in at 41 and a half pounds, measuring over 42 inches. So that's an awesome lake trout. Next slide, please. And so a little bit of history about lake trout in Lake Erie. And lake trout, as I said, are native to the lake and were a major component of the fish community and an important food source for indigenous communities prior to European colonization. And following colonization, commercial fishing for lake trout began in the late 1700s. And by the late 1800s, exploitation of the lake trout populations led to their decline. Exploitation continued in the early 1900s, and two additional stressors, habitat degradation and introduction of invasive species like alewife and sea lamprey, contributed to continued population declines, which led to the loss of lake trout from Lake Erie by the mid-1960s. And if you want to see a picture of lake trout being parasitized by sea lamprey, that's what the image on the top is there. And so modern day restoration efforts for Lake Erie are considered to have begun in 1982, and over the past several decades, restoration efforts have included fishing regulations, stocking programs, invasive species control, research, assessment programs, and habitat restoration, like some of the novel jetting that was done to clear sediment and invasive mussel shells off of Brockton Shoal in Lake Erie earlier this year that Jason was involved with. And there's some images of that work in the center here. And then, despite being considered extirpated or locally extinct in Lake Erie only 60 years ago, restoration efforts for this species have led to a promising discovery a few years ago that the Lake Erie Fisheries Research Unit collected multiple recently hatched fry or juvenile lake trout from a rock reef west of Barcelona Harbor out in Lake Erie, which was evidence that successful natural lake trout reproduction was occurring in this area. And so with conditions for lake trout improving and evidence of natural reproduction, there's a growing need to better understand the ideal conditions for lake trout spawning habitat, which led to the development of the study you're going to be hearing more about this afternoon. And so before Joe begins, I just want to briefly situate this project within the broader Great Lakes fisheries and restoration effort context. And there's many native fish in the Great Lakes, including lake trout, cisco, and lake whitefish that spawn on cobble and gravel reefs, where their eggs settle into spaces between rocks and incubate over the winter. Increasing sedimentation and changing lake conditions fill those spaces with fine material, which reduces egg survival and has contributed to population declines. Through field measurements at the Shorehaven Reef in Lake Erie, lab experiments, and numerical modeling, Dr. Atkinson's WRI-funded project looks at how water movement maintains suitable substrate concentrations and how artificial reefs can be designed to recreate these processes and improve spawning success. Joe has also been involved in complementary research supported by New York Sea Grant, which is focused more on the biological and ecological side of this work, including work in Lake Ontario's embayments, looking at how sediment affects egg survival and native fish recruitment, and sharing those findings with anglers, educators, and coastal communities. Joe, the University of Buffalo, and New York Sea Grant also developed a video series featuring Joe and his collaborators and students, explaining how this work was done in the field and in the lab, and its significance and management relevance. And these videos should be released publicly very soon, and we can follow up with information about that for those who are interested. But Joe is going to start off today showing us a short clip from that video series. And with that, I'll pass things off to Joe.
Thanks, wonderful introduction. And I think we'll pick up on a number of the things that you just mentioned throughout the presentation here. So just to give you a warning, this is about a 3.5 minute video. I'm not going to show you the long one, but most of the videos here are relatively short, and the objective was to come up with something that was pithy and sort of captures attention, but doesn't go too long. I picked the working in the lab video to show primarily because it shows the work that was supported by WRI over the summer, which was conducted mostly by several undergraduate researchers at the University of Buffalo. So I'm just going to turn it on, and we can come back to this later. This video also happens to provide a nice introduction to the rest of the presentation. So please enjoy. This project has a couple of objectives. In the first place, we wanted to learn what was happening with spawning habitat in the Great Lakes and how sedimentation factors could impact the ability of fish to successfully spawn. And the other is that eventually we wanted to try to improve spawning in the Great Lakes by native fishes. So one of the ideas that was being tested in this project is the creation of artificial reefs. This project is funded by two entities, the New York Sea Grant Institute and the New York Water Resources Institute. The Water Resources Institute funded two undergraduates in a research experience over the summer, and they have been primarily responsible for the two experiments here. Right now I'm standing in the Environmental Fluid Hydraulics Laboratory, and we are going to look at a couple of experiments here that we're doing to try to advance those objectives.
Essentially, with the mixing box, we're observing bead suspension under different sediment conditions. The beads are supposed to represent fish eggs that would be found in Lake Erie. The order that we kind of assemble everything depends on what we're putting in there. So, if we have just rocks and our artificial fish eggs, we're going to put the rocks in, then we'll fill it with water, and then we'll put the eggs in a semi-even layer on top of those rocks. The grid moving up and down generates turbulence in the water, which is something you might see in Lake Erie that could disturb the fish eggs. From the mixing box, we saw that there was a really abrupt decrease between having sand or a flat bottom on the mixing box, between having some larger rocks at the bottom. With those larger rocks, we also observed some of the beads could kind of get down into those spaces and be sheltered and protected.
So the basic idea of the experiment we're doing in the flume is we're trying to create a scale model of a reef. And then we are creating flows in the flume that are mimicking in a scaled way the flows that we are measuring with our ADCP in the field. Then we put dye in to visualize the flow that's going over the crest of the reef.
That's really just so that we can actually see the little eddies. They're called eddies, but the little swirls in the water. And those eddies in the lake, they scour the rock, which clears away a lot of the gravel in and around the reef, the ridge. Best case scenario with this research is we're going to get the best design for a artificial reef to provide the fish with a habitat that they need.
I'm excited because I think we've demonstrated in at least a qualitative way this impact of sand or fine sediment filling the spaces between rocks where eggs would normally like to have gone, as sedimentation changes in the lake, those areas are getting filled in by fine sediment. It's reducing the habitat that is available for fish to successfully spawn in.
It interests me because I want to make an impact on the fish being able to sustain their own populations and not just have to be brought in from farm-raised fish.
I was really drawn to this research because its ultimate purpose is to help fisheries in Lake Erie, and I also grew up in the area. I just grew up exploring Lake Erie and all of its tributaries, so it kind of hits home for me.
So that brings us to the beginning of the formal presentation. I just wanted to point out that two of the pictures that Ryan showed on one of his slides was before the jet action and after the jet action that cleaned the sediment. That's really kind of in a nutshell what we are trying to look at is we're trying to create clean sediment, and clean meaning not rocks or cobble that is not filled in with finer sediment and preventing eggs from getting down into their protected spaces. Okay, so like I said, I think that video hopefully will provide some background, and some of the slides I'll show will come back to some of the things we saw in the video. The site that we worked on over the summer was in the Shorehaven Reef or Barcelona Reef, a little southwest of Dunkirk. You can see it in the little red circle there in the. So the motivation of the study was basically the observation that we needed to create. We needed to help lake trout create a self-sustaining population, and this was something that came up in discussions with Jason a couple years ago, I guess, and it turned into a proposal to the Water Resources Institute, which funded this work. So implementation of the rehabilitation plan has led to the need to identify physical characteristics in the lake that impact spawning success and habitat preferences, and that's really the objective of this study. Okay, quick overview. Underlying hypothesis: loss of suitable habitat has negatively affected successful spawning, and that loss of habitat is primarily due to silt and sand filling in spaces that were otherwise or had previously been suitable habitat for lake trout or other native species. And what if we generalize that statement just a little bit, we're looking not only at cobble that isn't filled in, but the right physical characteristics also include flow over that area, sedimentation characteristics, or bottom characteristics of the sediment. They have to be right. The fish have to recognize the area as a place that's going to be good for them to spawn their eggs. The study was conducted to better understand physical conditions that would produce suitable spawning and suggest guidelines for artificial reef design. And we used a combination of field observations, lab experiments, and numerical modeling, with the focus on Shorehaven Reef, which I pointed out in the map previously. Jason, this is yours.
Sure. So I guess I'll just tell a little bit of the story about how this project came to be. What you're seeing here is one of the only spawning aggregations of lake trout in Lake Erie that we've ever found, and we've been looking for 30 years for these fish, where they're spawning. And we couldn't find it for a long time. We employed this relatively new technology called acoustic telemetry. We were able to pinpoint some areas where they were congregating at spawning time, and that's what you're seeing here. Pretty much immediately after we looked at the acoustic telemetry results, we dropped a camera down and immediately found a spawning aggregation. And then after that, we documented that there were actually fry coming off. So we're documenting successful spawning. And so that led us to ask, what about this particular area makes it successful? And it's the fact, as you've already heard, that it has clean rock and relatively deep interstices that the eggs can fall down into and be protected from weather and predators over winter. And so instead of just dumping rock in, we wanted to look for someone who had the skill set to look at the conditions, the local conditions here, and tell us if we were going to build an artificial reef, how would we design it? so that we could maximize the areas that would stay clean and with relatively deep interstices over time. And luckily we found Joe and his crew, and they were able to start us down the road of answering that question.
Okay, thank you. So our specific objectives were to, again, following this theme of identifying physical characteristics that were led to a successful spawning area. We had to evaluate the stresses impacting fish spawning success, and mostly focusing on the bottom being covered with sand and silt. So basically all project components that I talked about on the previous slide were used in that objective. We wanted to develop a predictive methodology to evaluate possible mitigation measures, such as installation of artificial reefs to manage sediment movement and improve spawning success. You know, it's kind of interesting. We did a major literature review of artificial reef design, and most of it is in marine settings, and most of it is to prevent scouring. So, you know, we want to do the opposite. We want to try to enhance scouring, not spawning. We want to enhance scouring to improve spawning. And primarily we're using a numerical model for that. I won't get into the details of that, but certainly I could answer questions if you have them later. And then we wanted to communicate project results to relevant stakeholders, including angler communities and other researchers. We have a final project report to the Water Resources Institute, and I think that's publicly available. The videos, as we were talking about before, we're working on a publication or two, and then outreach such as this meeting. Project activities included field observations. We worked with Jason, and he provided a boat and a crew to take us out over the area, over the reef. We could drop a GoPro camera and look at the bottom and see what's going on down there. And then more importantly, we deployed our acoustic Doppler current profiler, ADCP. I'll refer to that later as an ADCP. During the summer in 10 different deployments at different lengths of time, one of them several weeks, just to get an idea of what kind of velocities were there so that we could also get an idea of what kind of sediment movement might be associated with those kinds of velocities. Obviously, or hopefully it's obvious, higher velocity, higher kinetic energy in the water means probably it's more likely to have a relatively clean bottom. We did laboratory experiments. Those are both listed in the video, grid mixing box and the flume. We actually did 2 experiments in the flume, one that was not in the video, but I'll come to that shortly. Numerical modeling, and again, I'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. But the basic idea behind the numerical model is to simulate flow and sediment movement around the targeted reef areas. Where does sediment settle? Where is it eroded? And if we can identify that, and we can identify why it settles or erodes in different positions, then we have a basis on which to try to design artificial reefs. Okay, starting with the field work, ADCP, again, acoustic Doppler current profiler. This measures the water velocities. It sits on the bottom. Some people down in Jason's shop put together an anchor for the ADCP. We lifted it and set it up with a little winch here and dropped it, and it sits on the bottom, and it shoots an acoustic signal upwards. And the reflection of that signal with a Doppler shift that depends on velocity tells us the velocity profile in the water. So this was, as much as anything, accomplished 2 purposes. One, it gave us an idea of what the hydraulic environment looked like. And it also gave us some data that we could compare with our numerical model to make sure the numerical model was predicting velocities that were in the right ballpark. This is, I don't know if you can see this down in the lower right, lists Shorehaven, which is very hard to find on a map, but it's a little bit southwest of Dunkirk and not too far from Barcelona. There were 3 areas in the reef that had been identified as places where fish were observed to spawn. We're going to location 5G in the middle there. That's where we put most of our ADCP deployments. The image was mostly bathymetry there, but so the typical depths are on the order of 10 meters, little or less. Less certainly on top of the reef there, several meters less than that. So these are the ADCP deployment locations. And again, this is zoom in on area 5G. And I just want to point out the flow direction is kind of from more or less from the west to the east. And then as you get into closer to shore, between the shore and the reef, the flow is northeast up towards Buffalo. And the reef, you can think of the reef as being this line here. And that's just keep that in mind. You don't need to look at this whole table. I just wanted to point out the areas, the columns identified with the red boxes. We have 10 deployments from as little as 15 minutes, just to get a quick snapshot of what's going on. One was 3 days, and then at the bottom there, you can see a 10-day deployment and a 28-day deployment, where we wanted to get an idea of what was happening on a longer time scale. If you put the instrument in for 15 minutes, that doesn't really tell you too much except what's going on at that instant in time, which isn't bad, but it doesn't give you the full picture. And then just our summation of directions here. Most of them are in the northeast direction, for most of the deployments. And these deployments were at different locations along the reef, sort of at the windward or the waterward, I guess, currentward, the place where the water comes up to the reef, along the slope, along the crest of the reef, and then along the leeward side of the reef, as well as some other places. And so that there are 10 deployments, different locations, different lengths of time. This is just a part of a record from the deployment 10. This was the 28-day period. And the thing that's interesting here is the fact that you can see that it oscillates between approximately plus or minus 15 centimeters per second. So again, if you put the instrument out there for a short period of time, 15 minutes, maybe even a couple hours, it might only show you a velocity in one direction, and you might conclude that that's the direction the velocity is always in, but it's clearly not only in that one direction, at least in this location. In fact, in one of our deployments, was apparently during a turnover event, and we saw I think that was in deployment 3, and we saw a major shifting of the velocities that correlated with the turnover event. So again, sometimes you have to put the instrument out for a longer period of time to get a better idea of what's going on. So those velocities, the plus or minus 15 centimeters per second, were useful for looking at what our numerical model was telling us. But meanwhile, laboratory experiments. So this is the mixing box that you saw earlier, and some dimensions. You saw the grid moving before with different bottom conditions. We could either put nothing in the bottom, just a plain plexiglass bottom. We could put sand. We put pebble, pea gravel, and we put rocks. And we put rocks with sand, which is what you see in this particular picture. The so-called fish eggs, are plastic beads with a diameter of 5 millimeters and a specific gravity just a little bit over 1.05. And that was the closest we could get, and that has been used in several previous experiments using pseudo or surrogate fish eggs, because they behave physically at least similar to what a fish egg would behave like. So the basic idea here was to look to see what was happening as a function of grid oscillation frequency. As the grid moves faster, it generates more turbulence, stirs up more eggs, more likely to stir up the eggs. And then what happens when you put different bottom substrate in? And what you can see here kind of qualitatively, you'll see a more quantitative plot in just a moment, is on the left-hand side, you have just rocks. On the right-hand side, you have rocks with a lot of sand also. this is to simulate that idea of the reef that has been filled, where the rocks have been filled with sand, and basically eliminating the interstices that the eggs could fall into. And if you count the eggs, or just at a quick glance, you can see there are a lot more eggs in suspension on the right-hand side because they've been prevented from getting into the crevices, into the interstices that the rocks would otherwise provide. So that was the effect of adding sand or sediment to the bed, is it prevents eggs from getting into the bed. So these are just a result of all our tests. The horizontal axis is the grid oscillation frequency, which is, you can think of it as a measure of the turbulence level, higher turbulence towards the right, lower to the left. And then each of these curves is described briefly on the legend to the left. The red hand plot is when there's nothing on the bottom. It's just a plain plexiglass grid. Virtually, at least when you get up to 2 or 3 hertz frequency of oscillation, they're virtually 90 to 100%, almost 100% of the eggs are in suspension. You might expect that would be the case. And even for a little tiny bit of oscillation after at least more than 1.67 hertz, and I haven't translated that to a turbulence energy, although that can be done. But right away you see some eggs, some beads being suspended there, as well as with that other test, which is test 6, which I'll get to in a moment. The green plot is test 4, which is just sand on the bottom. It doesn't behave, or at least the bead behavior wasn't significantly different than it was with a plain bottom. The sand doesn't provide much shelter for the eggs to get into. And then as I'm moving down, now the sort of the purplish plot is test 6. That's rocks with sand. So that's with rocks with a lot of sand, by the way. So kind of like the picture you saw in the previous slide here. And again, a little bit of shelter, but not too much. Test 3, the yellow one, is just with pea gravel, and it took a little more mixing energy to get the. I'm sorry about that. I don't know. Can't explain that, but anyway, we're back where we were. So I think the bottom line for this graph is just it is an indication or a demonstration of the sheltering effect of different kinds of substrate, with the idea being that the rock, cobble rocks with crevices with interstices provide a place where eggs can settle into. Okay, laboratory flume experiments. So we are doing 2 experiments, and this is the first one. We're looking at to see how fast does water have to move to start moving sediment in the field. So we set up a test, which is schematically shown here. Water comes from the right to the left, and I think you can see my arrow here. We put a little test section in here. We have a false bottom in the flume. We put a little test section here and filled it up with the sediment we wanted to test, and then we would gradually increase the flow of water until we reached a water velocity where we could see the sediment moving. So here's a picture of the actual test. We have a velocity probe, so we can measure the velocity when something interesting happens. Here's the pan that was filled with the sediment that we're testing. When we were filling the flume, you put the sediment test in, and then we had to protect it while the water was initially filling the flume, and we did that with an inverted plexiglass box. And so then we slowly, after the water level was at the right level, we slowly raised the box and started the flume up. And we tested this with sand. We tested it with sand plus some rocks. We tested it with mud that was collected from Barcelona Harbor as an indication of what was actually in the field at that site. Here's just one example of erosion patterns, flows from right to left. And the thing I would just point out is there's a very uneven, there's a lot of erosion right at the foreground of these leading rocks, not so much in the middle, and again, more at the back. And you can see sand being transported into onto the flume surface here. So there's definitely some erosion, net erosion going on. And just to summarize these experiments, and again, what we wanted to see is how fast does water have to move to really maintain a clean environment. And the results here were a little counterintuitive, except that I would say that sand is up here, mud, the Barcelona harbor mud is down here, and the velocity that was required to get it to move was a lot lower at the critical, you can call it a critical velocity for movement of sediment is much lower for the mud than it was for the sand. And some mixed, and the reason there's such a wide variation here is we had 3 people looking at these, and you could start, and we each identified a range of velocities where we first started seeing sediment movement. So these are very qualitative, I guess, but it does give you an idea that somewhere in the 10 to 15, maybe up to 20 centimeters per second range, you would start to see sediment movement in the field, because those are for the rock, or sorry, for the mud samples. Sorry. Then we looked at what are the flow characteristics over the reef. So I'm not sure, I don't remember if Jason mentioned this when we looked at the video of the fish, but what we were told by the crew down at the fish lab down in Dunkirk is that the main spawning areas are on the leeward, just on the leeward side of the crest of the reef. So if you look at this schematic at the bottom here, the flow is from right to left again, and you can kind of simplify the reef shape as a trapezoid, or even really simpler as a triangle, probably mostly as a trapezoid. But the place where the spawning would occur would be just on a fairly small region on the leeward side of the crest of the reef. So why there and why not somewhere else? So that's a question I'm not sure we have a full answer to, but we wanted to get a little more of an idea. We constructed some reef models and put them in the flume, constructed of plywood, marine plywood, and we looked at both triangular and trapezoidal shapes. We looked at some cases with just smooth surfaces and others where we put pea gravel on just to simulate some additional roughness on as you might see in the field. We measured the bathymetry out in the field, and we chose the slopes on the upwind and downwind, or windward and leeward sides, to mimic field slopes. And we did a couple tests with some different variations of slopes. And then we used a hydraulic practice of something called Froude's number scaling to figure out, given the height of the model that we have, how fast should the water be moving to mimic field conditions. And that was based on something called Froude number similarity. And again, if anybody is interested in going into that in more detail, I'd be happy to talk about that further. And then mostly we did dye visualization, and we measured the velocities, and we tried to get velocities such that our hydraulic scaling was correct, and that we were truly representing conditions in the field. And then we injected dye to visualize the flow patterns. And you saw some videos of that earlier, that this creation of these eddies is something that was pretty common. In fact, if the velocity is too high, the flow just overshoots the crest and doesn't return. And down here, and I hope you can see these streaks of dye. This is dye moving upstream back towards the crest, moving this way, even though the flow is moving from right to left. There's a recirculation pattern kind of like this, and moving flow back this way. And again, these are the areas that would be where spawning was observed. So just a summary of some observations. Again, the Froude number scaling is a method that we can use to recreate dynamically similar conditions in the field as we see in the field. The velocity magnitudes, when you scale the velocities from the lab experiment to the field scale, they're in the 15 meters per second range when we see these eddies form. So, and then not shown here, but flow in the trapezoidal model didn't generally create the smaller eddies that we see in the triangular model, but there was still a very strong recirculation pattern, as I hopefully outlined with the arrow. And then the numerical modeling we did is consistent with those observations. So numerical modeling, we used something called a Delft-Swan model, which includes waves and sediment transport. So it basically is water currents, water waves. Both of those contribute to shear stress, which adds to sediment movement. We can run it in either three-dimensional or two-dimensional form. We ran it mostly in two-dimensional form, which means everything is depth averaged. And the reason for that is because we're not looking at a very deep part of the lake. We're looking at relatively shallow water, and the conditions over the depth of the water don't change very much. So we could get by with a vertically averaged two-dimensional model. The benefit of doing that is we can run many more models more quickly than if we were using a three-dimensional model. Then the other technique we use is we need to take into account what's happening across the whole lake, because the whole lake conditions provide the physics of what's going on at our reef. But we really don't want to look at in order to look at what we wanted to look at and the reef, we needed a model with several meter resolution. We can't have a model with a 2-kilometer resolution and even see the reef in the bathymetry of the model. So we had a 2-meter horizontal scale for our numerical model. Then the problem is, well, I don't want to do the whole lake at 2 meters. We could be sitting for several months to do a 1 month. We would probably be taking longer than real time to do the simulation if we did the whole lake at 2 meters. So what we did is something called a nested approach, where we used the Great Lakes Coastal Forecast System model, which is online, and you can download all of their data. But their horizontal scales are on the order of several kilometers. So we had to step those down by basically taking one of their grids and putting our own model inside of that, and then taking one of those models grids and putting another model inside of it, so that each successive step we get down to a smaller and smaller scale, more highly resolved model, which is what we used for the reef. The model output gives us velocities, bottom shear stresses, and changes in bed sediment thickness. And we did simulations for June, where we had a number of our ADCP deployments were in June. So just a sample of some of the results. These are depth averaged flow velocity, magnitude, and direction given by the direction of the arrows, magnitude given by the length of the arrows. And again, here's Shorehaven. Our region of interest here is Area 5G, which is out here approximately. And again, you can see this flow coming over the reef is more or less in a primarily western to eastern direction. And then the flow along here, primarily in this northeast direction up towards Buffalo, towards the upper right. And the other thing I want to point out is a fairly strong flow in that along-shore current. And that's something I'll comment on a little bit later. Okay, here, if you look up at the upper left over here, this is the reef. I showed a picture of that earlier. And this is the cross-section, this dotted line. So it's kind of going across the reef from the point to the west, to the northwest a little bit, to the southeast. And these are the flows. I'm sorry, I know you can't see the arrows too well, but you can see the magnitudes as the flow comes up over the reef. Here's the reef cross-section. So this side here corresponds to the western edge of this cross-section. And the water velocities are relatively low. As they come up the reef, the depth of the water becomes smaller, and the velocities are accelerated as they come up along the reef. And then they become actually quite high right here and maintain that intensity on the far side of the reef. And what you can also, hopefully you can see, is the arrow directions here point downward. Now, the reason that's interesting is because that's consistent with what we saw in the flume experiments. Remember, if you remember, the dye would come over the top of the crest and then curl under and even rotate back as in a circular eddy kind of formation. The numerical resolution in the vertical direction wasn't sufficient to see that circulation, that eddy formation, but it does show the downward flow over the crest of the reef, which is something that you would have to see if those eddies were in fact present. We're currently doing some more tests with a higher resolution to, in fact, see if we can generate the eddies with the numerical model. Again, the magnitude of the velocities here, 14 to 15 in the red. Again, that's in the range that's going to cause sediment to move, or at least it's going to cause the mud to move. It's not going to cause the big rocks to move, but it's going to cause the mud to move. And then this is just an example of what we can do with the model, is to simulate areas after some period of simulation where sediment has accumulated and areas where it has eroded. The depositional areas are in red. I'm sorry, the depositional areas are in blue. Sorry, I said it right the first time. Depositional areas are in red, the erosional areas are in blue. And that you can see that with the change in sediment thickness, which is the scale on the right-hand side. So again, the reef is kind of in here. If you think about the previous figures I've shown. So you can see deposition is occurring on the windward side, and that's where the velocities are the slowest. If you remember the couple of the slide here, this is what we're looking. This is where deposition is occurring, because the velocities, it's at least consistent with the idea that the velocities are lowest in this range. The velocities get higher, and it gradually changes over into a more erosional area here. And I have to overlay the bathymetry a little better here to see that that's a very high erosional area here. This is off the reef, though. So the spawning area that, again, has been visualized or been spotted in the field is just on the leeward side of the reef, which is probably right up in here. So I think this erosion that's occurring here is more a function of that nearshore current that's moving along parallel to the shoreline than it is flow over the reef. I think flow over the reef is contributing to erosion in this area, but flow here is contributing to a clean area here. So you might ask, well, why are fish spawning here and not here? I think the velocities might be too high here, and or the substrate isn't right. The substrate in this region closer to shore is really not that cobbly, interstitial, rich area that you see on the reef. It's more of a flat plain area. So I think there has to be this combination of parameters that lead to a good spawning area. Okay. Discussion and conclusions. From numerical model and field observations, we can see, as I've just pointed out, areas of erosion and deposition correspond with distributions of bottom shear stress, and also with the velocity field, which are also correlated with the velocity field. However, the erosional zone on the leeward side of the reef may be due to eddies, but I think it's more due to the stronger coastal current. That's something that's perhaps not a totally answered question, but it seems likely that it's more due to the strong current. Erosional areas are consistent with observed spawning sites, at least those that are on the reef. And I should point out that we published a paper recently looking at Sodus Bay and Chameau Bay in Lake Ontario, and showed that observed spawning sites also correspond with erosional areas in those two sites. From the experimental work, we can demonstrate, at least qualitatively, if not semi-quantitatively, relationships between near bed turbulence, bed characteristics, and simulated fish egg movement. And we demonstrated possible flow patterns over the reef that could generate erosion on the leeward side of the crest, as observed in the field. And there's a couple other experiments I didn't talk about, but that's all. Those are the main things. And then getting back to the bottom line, so to speak, how does this all feed into artificial reef design? So I should say that the artificial reefs have been built in the Great Lakes. They've been built, a lot of artificial reefs have been built around the world, but particularly in the Great Lakes. There was one off of Olcott in Lake Ontario, a relatively recent one in Lake Michigan was reported. But anyway, they've been proposed and have been tried in these couple of instances as possible mitigation for loss of natural spawning habitat. The goal of an artificial reef would be to create erosional areas. I think that's really one of the main takeaways from this work is that we need to create these erosional areas to keep the bottom sediment where there are already cobbles and interstices available. We need to keep them clean so that fish will recognize them as good spawning areas. And in order to do that, we need to maintain a nice level of bottom turbulence or velocity to keep things swept away. Based on this work, those areas would be on the leeward side of a triangular or trapezoidal reef oriented with the crest reef perpendicular to the flow direction. So you want the flow coming over the crest. And that's where cobbles are likely to be, and that's where, according to the numerical model and some of the experiments, that's where we expect to see erosion occurring. This isn't perhaps a totally deep conclusion, or not a surprising one anyway, because it essentially mimics natural conditions where spawning occurs, which might say, well, we just need to create conditions. We need to find successful spawning areas and then recreate them somehow. But what does that mean? What does that mean to recreate them? And I would say one of the things that we need to do is create, if you want to figure out how deep or how high should the reef be, well, that depends on the local flow conditions, and that can be determined on the basis of this Froude number similarity that I talked about earlier. And then finally, it's not clear how important the windward and leeward slopes are. We just tried to mimic what we saw in the field, but if you were going to build a reef, you wouldn't necessarily want to spend the money for all that material on a long, gradual slope on the windward side. But I would just say things to keep in mind with the leeward slope should not be so steep that eggs couldn't settle vertically. So you can create very nice eddies off the crest if you have a vertical side. Well, that's obviously not going to be a good spawning area. So somewhere between vertical and something that's flat would be what we want. But a steep slope, but not too steep. And then the windward slope doesn't. Well, I don't know what the importance of the windward slope is, except it might be important for the long-term structural stability of the reef. There's wave attack to keep in mind when you're building a reef that you have to protect against, and that might be part of what the and again, I'm looking at nature created this. So why did nature create this? I think it might have to do with structural stability of the reef, but I don't really know the answer to that. That's it for me. Thank you for your attention.